Hey there, hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well. We've been talking about the World Trade Organization, and so now what I'd like to do is take a special PowerPoint presentation on China's entrance into the World Trade Organization. Okay, so let's get into this. And keep in mind now, there's a narrated version of these, as you know, because you're listening to me now, but there's also a non-narrated version of all the course lectures, and you can always access those to go through things and to find greater detail. Or, the great part about all this is that you can look at things a second time or third time if you're unclear about something. Sometimes I know for myself I have to read something 3 or 4 times before I really get it, and so that's why I make both versions available to you. Okay, so China, as you hopefully know, is on the Asian continent. China's made up of the mainland China component here. You see all this here. And then there are 2 administrative regions. So these are different. They are managed politically different. They are basically what's known as one country, 2 systems. So you have one country, but there's 2 systems of political management. So the 2 areas that are part of this one country, 2 systems is the area of Hong Kong, which was a British colony for about 150 years, and there's about 7.4 million people living there. And the other is Macau, which was a Portuguese colony that has about 670,000 people, and the Portuguese controlled that area for about over 450 years. So substantial amount of time that China's been controlled or influenced by European countries. So we'll get more into that in a little bit. Now keep in mind that the Republic of China is Taiwan, and that area is not part of the People's Republic of China. Okay, so there's a difference between the 2. Taiwan is independent. Okay, so China's communist. So in communism, for those that may not be aware, it's a system of government in which the state plans and controls the economy, not individual corporations, not small businesses. It's the state that does the control. And it's usually and often an authoritarian political party that holds the power. And the state has different controls that it imposes upon the economy and the people that live within it. And there's no such thing as private ownership of property and capital. And which is kind of interesting, because I've talked with some realtor friends, and they're telling me that there's been a lot of Chinese money coming into California and the Bay Area, so that individuals from China could buy property, because they can't do that in China. Interesting claim. So the idea behind communism is that they do this. They have this political system because it makes progress towards a higher social order. So in other words, it makes it better for everyone when they rely on a single authoritarian party. So does trade then, since this course is about trade and the environment, does trade facilitate their political goals? Oh yeah, of course, because it brings in a lot of money that then they can use as they wish. Okay, so why are we interested in China? Because it's big, capital B-I-G. It's got over 1.3 billion people. It's about 20% of the world's population, and they have nuclear weapons and a large army. Now, why would you be concerned with that? Well, because they engaged in war with the United States via Korea in the 1950s, which is technically unresolved because there's no peace treaty. So there's a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. But in the 1950s, it was the Chinese that came into North Korea, to attack U.S. forces, because the North Koreans were at risk of losing that war, and then that ended up leading to the stalemate that we still have today. So the United States and the European Union, that's what EU means here, they consider China's economic growth an opportunity in this globalized economy, because all nations are deeply intertwined. So the Chinese leaders realize that national development depends on the international marketplace, and they want to be part of it. So this chart that I show you down below here, this is just showing you their population. So it's been growing substantially. It's expected to level off. We'll see if that actually happens. Okay, so sorry, I'll get on to that next slide. Oh, sorry about that slight delay there. So economic growth, right? China's been growing substantially since what this shows you is a graph between 78 and 2018. This percentage of economic growth. So it's been growing substantially. More on that a little bit later. But let's just compare the economic growth of China with the United States. So you can see that the U.S. has had this substantial growth, as does China, and this the gap between the GDPs of China and the United States kept increasing until 2006. And after that, you see that China's been catching up. The gap between the U.S. and China is much less. So the Chinese gross domestic product has been growing substantially. And so now it's at it is the number 2 economy in the world, behind the United States, and it's growing fast. So the gross domestic product of the United States, that's the value of all goods and services, has been growing at about 2.5% in 2019 and 20, whereas China's been growing at 6.3%. So it's growing about, not quite 3 times as much. It's also kind of interesting to look here and see that India growing at 7.4%. So you see the countries with the 2 largest populations in the world having the fastest economic growth. So we need to talk about history, because that's relevant to China's ascension to the World Trade Organization. And why? Well, because of course, because China's big, but also because it's good to respect and understand what others have gone through. Because when you do, you can you understand each other better. The countries understand each other better. You can negotiate better, reach better agreements for all. Sounds like a good strategy for any kind of business. So the events that happened from like the 1830s to the 50s changed and shaped how China deals with the West and the world. So that means how they deal with joining the WTO. So between the 1830s and 1950s, there was a lot of defeats and indignities due to the West and the Western view of China and their colonialization of China. And in that time, China had lost its sovereignty and control over its own country. And they had these things called the unequal countries, that are unequal treaties, which we'll discuss more. And so this resistance that they ended up developing to outside control established communism. And I have this quote here from Dwight Eisenhower, who was the President of the United States and was the commander of the Allied forces in World War II. Okay, so we'll talk about China from the 1830s to the 1950s, and we'll go through each one of these things. Well, maybe won't go through all of them, but I'll discuss them. Okay, so history shapes countries and peoples, and that's the point here. China had been an agricultural economy for over 4,000 years. And by the way, this is going to be an ultra-condensed historical snapshot, so just bear that in mind. There's so much to study about this, so I'm just going to hit some highlights. So the Qing dynasty and this Manchu dynasty was, way back 1368 to 1654, recognized as one of these eras of orderly government and social stability. That all changed, and thought it was interesting to note that as we get into like the era of the 19th century, that one of the major exports from China had been tea, And it's interesting to see in terms of like foreign involvement. Here's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president during World War II and during the Depression with his mother, and her father became rich from the opium and tea trade in China during this period of the unequal treaties. So what were the unequal treaties? Well, it was basically when China was carved up, as you can see in this graphic that came from that period of time, and it was from countries that were all trying to take advantage of China. So that included Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. And then Britain, of course, ended up taking control of Hong Kong for it's actually over 100 years. So there was economic destabilization. As foreign trade increased from the West, China's economy changed. Their currency was brought down. British Trade Company would use opium as currency. There was lots of drug addiction because of the opium trade, lots of unemployment, and then what happened over we'll go back 100 and more, almost 200 years really. There were these key 4 rebellions. There were actually many, many more than this, but there were the Treaty of Nanjing, which ended that opium war, and then began the first of these unequal treaties. The Treaty of Tientsin, which ended that second opium war. This open door policy, which began in 1899 between the U.S. and China and Japan and many European countries. And the idea behind that was that each one of those countries wanted equal access to trade. And it was basically about control over the Chinese trade. And then that lasted until 1949, when the Chinese Civil War ended, which kind of led to where we're at today with China. And then there was other rebellions, the Taiping rebellion, significant, another civil war, where that was basically the leading towards the end of the Qing dynasty. Not quite, but leading to it. And then there was the Boxer Rebellion, which we'll get into a little bit more. And there were many more. And this is significant that there was a war between China and Japan, 1894, where they were fighting over Korea, and why it was basically for access to resources, coal and iron. And then that led to Japan emerging as a world power, and then we know what happened with that in the 1930s, when Japan had more influence in the world and became a military power, and then used it. Okay, so now we're getting into the communist movement in China. Again, this begins with the Boxer Rebellion, which was an attempt to remove foreigners from China, and was successful to a large degree. And there was also many massacres of missionaries and Christian converts. They also resulted in a lot of starvation and extreme poverty. And so bottom line is, this set the stage for Mao Zedong and the communist philosophies of Marx to take place in China. So in 1911, communism starts to come in after this cultural and intellectual movement. Of course, right around near the same time, this was also happening in Russia. So activists wanted to modernize China, eliminate the Confucianism, and so Chinese wanted to change the culture, education, economics, the government, and many of the Chinese activists were angered with a betrayal in the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, because that created benefits that for other countries and their use of China. So China then turns to Marxism, and then later a larger communist movement. So the end of the Qing dynasty happened around this time, about 1912. this is maybe you saw this movie, The Last Emperor. Great movie. So The Last Emperor was this guy Pu Yi, who was actually quite young at the time. He was just a baby when he was in charge, and then he was forced abdication in 1912. Later, Japan invades China in 1932. They reinstalled him, but he was really a puppet emperor. He had no real power. They controlled him. And then in the 1940s, Mao imprisoned Pu Yi, and he was eventually pardoned, and then he died in 1967. So now we're getting into World War II, or getting close to that. So Japan wanted net raw resources, raw materials. They invade China in 1940, and there's resistance, and but they are defeated by Japan. In World War II, the British arrive, or just before World War II, and it was just 6 weeks later that they became prisoners of war in World War II. Japanese had firm control then in China. So we'll move in here in 1918, going back just a little bit. There was World War II, but you'll see how this all connects. The Chinese Civil War was resumed after the end of World War II, and it was basically Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist, versus the party, the military forces that were controlled by Mao. Mao Zedong, by the way, also see this name here, Zedong. So same guy, two different names. So there was a conflict over differences in wealth, land ownership, politics. Ultimately, Mao won, took over mainland China, and Kai-shek moved to Taiwan, where he established free China, democratic China. So now you get into this other period, the Great Leap Forward. That's what the Chinese had termed it. It was about 1958, and the idea was to transform China's economy from this agrarian society to industrial. Not entirely successful, because there's this deadly famine. Many believe it was the deadliest famine in history. 20 to nearly 50 million people died in just a period of about 4 years. And later, in 1966, Mao launches the Cultural Revolution, which was to remove counter-revolutionary elements. In other words, people that he did not agree with. So that went on for about 10 years. Violent class struggle, widespread destruction of cultural artifacts, tens of millions persecuted, and there could have been, there's estimated ranges of how many people died, but it could have been hundreds of thousands, may have been millions, probably more like millions. And yet, during this time, when Mao's in charge, the Chinese population nearly doubles. And then ultimately, Mao dies in 75, 76. Yeah, it's 1976. And he's succeeded by Deng Xiaoping, who is recognized as being the architect of modern China. So what we're doing, I'm just trying to explain to you how China, a little bit about their history, which led to who they are and how they operate now economically. So just a reminder here now, so as we're getting into global trade, the Bretton Woods Conference, which we've already talked about in 1944, about international markets, and then established GATT, which later became the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and others. So we know that 50 years after that, about the World Trade Organization was created, but China is not part of the original WTO or GATT. So 94, GATT becomes the WTO, and and the idea here is to move trade smoothly as possible, predictably and freely. But again, you've got a nice long lecture on this that was previous to this one here. Okay, so what does the WTO do? Just again to remind you, it's a mechanism for members to negotiate trade fairly. It was to address restrictions and tariffs, reduce those. Most favored nation status, make sure that the rules were same for all of those countries. Retaliation is permitted only when violators of terms of trade are identified and noticed, and then there's a whole process, a dispute process that happens, which we discussed earlier, and that we know that countries can adopt penalties. All this is relevant because you'll see how some of that happens later with this, because China's been accused of making many violations. And the other part about this that's important with the WTO is that lesser developed countries, or developing nations as they're also known, they need and wanted access to markets, and China was seen as one of those. Okay, so negotiations then. 1948, China is one of the original signatories, but the revolution happens in China. The Communist Party takes over, Taiwan separates, and the application's withdrawn, and so nothing really happens then. Later, China notifies GATT, not Taiwan, but China notifies GATT that they want to resume contracting with the WTO. They go to meetings as observers, and they resume some contracting service status with the Swiss ambassador. Actually, they're working through him. And then there's Tiananmen Square, which delayed the processes of extraordinarily significant period of time. And then about 6 years later, China resumed its status. So what happened with Tiananmen? Well, it was protest, and it proved that the timing was not right. So there was large-scale protests, many demonstrations, mainly by students and intellectuals. So I guess that'd be people like you and me, right? They wanted economic change. They wanted democratic reform, and government applied force and arrested leaders and supporters, and several people disappeared after this. This is a very famous photograph here, considered one of the most iconic images, and this guy, known as Tank Man, was never seen again. He was known to stand in front of these tanks, and the tanks are trying to maneuver around him. So quite an important, iconic moment. So it's interesting about this, about Tiananmen Square, is that it was a few years later when there was the spring, and when countries in the Middle East moved towards democracy, and there was a huge amount of change that happened there. So it seems as though perhaps the Chinese missed their moment to become democratic, but perhaps they didn't really have a chance because of the communist control of the country. Okay, so key players considered China's admission to the WTO as crucial. So that would be the European Union, that's these countries here, and the United States and Japan, all of which are the main trading economies in the world, the largest economies in the world. So the objectives of the European Union was to engage China bilaterally, which means between them and China and the EU, to have an upgraded political dialogue. They wanted to support China's transition to an open society based upon rule and respect for human rights. So this is a nod to democracy and encouraging China's integration into the world economy. So this is setting the stage. With the EU, the US, and Japan, basically the idea is, is to have China engage in a more open political system. So bottom line is they were looking towards trade as a mechanism for democratizing China. And the U.S., Japan, and Western Europe, and the European Union, they were encouraging China's reform by placing the country in a more favorable position than any of the other socialist countries. And that was important because the other socialist countries were in Eastern Europe, and this was around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Japan and Europe then end up extending official development assistance to China. So the negotiations then begin, so advocates of human rights were exerting pressure on the United States government not to sacrifice American values when dealing with China, and many argue that that was lost because what ended up happening was that there was more of a concern for economics than there were for people. The other argument is that the argument for economics was that if by having more trade, that having more money come into China would actually give rise to a middle class who would then ask for more human rights and would move the country towards democracy. Still to be seen if that's going to happen. And there was also concern about China and how they were treating Tibet and their authoritarian rule of that area. It's really about the money then, and how money can transform a particular political perspective, and then by the money it's about gaining access to the world's market. Both ways, China having access to markets, the global markets, and global markets having access to China's 1.3 billion people. So these other countries and corporations also wanted access to Chinese inexpensive services, such as labor and manufacturing. So the net result then is having reduced cost that would enhance the ability to increase market share, attracting customers, and increasing the potential for profit. So in the long run, many believe it's democracy. In the short run, there's losers. So, more about the negotiations. The United States leads the negotiating terms for China entering the WTO. The U.S. wanted China to join as a developed nation. It did not. It ended up as a developing nation. And then this was despite the fact that China was at the time about the 6th largest economy and is now the 2nd. So domestic policy principles was significant. And it's interesting about the money. There's some information here if you want to look at that. But today, China holds about $1.08 trillion in U.S. debt. So in other words, as the U.S. continues to spend more money than what it brings in, it has to borrow money to pay for its operations. And where do you think they're borrowing that money from? From China. Strange but true. Federal government spends way too much money. So you have this give and take diplomacy. China wants to join because it would allow China access to new trading partners. They'd have better rates with partners, with their current partners. There's prospects for improved living standards, and would give them a seat at the table in a globalized world so they could have more influence. And the United States wants something too. They want to influence China and to get it to move away from communism, but that's not quite how it happened. Here's another quote from another president, very similar to what Eisenhower was saying, but and Bush is important because he had been the ambassador to China in I think it was the 1970s, But he points out that no nation on earth has discovered a way to import the world's goods and services while stopping foreign ideas at the border. In other words, what he's saying is that when you have trade, global trade, you can move a country's politics. In other words, that democracy would come with increased trade. That was the belief. There was a lot of opposition to China's ascension to the WTO from many areas of the political spectrum: labor unions, human rights activists, religious conservatives, defense hawks. They were all against this. The opposition in the U.S. Congress slowed the process, but there was an agreement made in December of '99 with this belief that Congress had tools to deal with China. And those concerns were about the dumping of products and on other related issues, which we'll get into later. And the European Union shared this the ideas of the U.S. to have standards set for China's ascension, and then eventually there was this deal between the U.S. and China and the European Union. So there was many concessions that were given for industrial and agricultural products, and believe it or not, the insurance industry, and then a key one was allowing industry to choose which partners it wanted to work with when it was in China. So they wanted the U.S., the EU, Japan, others wanted China to keep its commitments, basic WTO agreements about not discriminating against other members, no dual pricing, meaning you can't charge one country one price and another a different price, and no agricultural export subsidies. Now, this one ended up being a big problem because, of course, the EU and the US maintained massive agricultural subsidies, but they weren't going to allow China to do it, although highly debatable if that was actually adhered to. So the U.S. and others achieved part of their objectives. China wanted, and China got some of what it wanted. China wanted to join, and it did join. And the membership allows it to help modernize the country and improve its position in the international system of trade and capitalism. So though the country is communist in terms of political affiliations, it's clearly has engaged in capitalism. In fact, they're probably better at being a capitalist than we are. The others would see that that China was pursuing WTO membership, so it could be seen by the reformers within China to lock in market reform process to further develop the country, and they've been remarkably successful with that. One of the concerns today is control of the knowledge economy. So as there's been evolution of the economy and markets, there is a significant amount of commerce that works through the knowledge economy. So that means tech, right? Okay, so China gets its ascension in 2001. Took about 15 years, but now they become members of the WTO. And almost instantly they become an economic powerhouse. Their economy had been growing at about 9%, as you saw earlier. Now it's less than that, but still nearly 7%. They become increasingly integrated into the global economy, and they have now become the world's second largest economy, the fourth largest exporter, and the third largest importer. and they are responsible for about 30% of the world's manufacturing output, an economic powerhouse to be sure. Now let's discuss a little bit about what was expected, what was hoped for, and then what really happened. So I borrowed this from a really great source that's down below here. So the hopes are that economically the United States would profit, and the realities are somewhat mixed. Consumers are paying much lower prices for imported Chinese goods. Corporations are profiting from increased access to markets, and yet industries like manufacturing have lost jobs because of the Chinese competition. So consumers broadly benefited, corporations benefited, labor unions, which had opposed their ascension, certain that cheaper labor would cost jobs in the U.S., and they were right. Between 1999 and 2011, about 6 million U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost. Now, and as we discussed earlier, some people believe that some of those were lost to because of automation. And in fact, it's believed that automation will actually bring many of these jobs back to the United States because the U.S. is better at using robots, for example, to manufacture products and goods, in particular in the automobile industry. So the next question is, what would happen to the Chinese economy? So the hopes was that China would profit, and then that's exactly what happened. Their economy has changed so much that it's been this massive change in poverty. About 400 million people, that's more people than live in the United States, were lifted from extreme poverty since 1999. Absolutely remarkable. China's economy, as we said, is now the second largest in the world, and it's 8 times larger than in 2001. Phenomenal import, or very impressive changes. And China is now exporting 5 times more than what they did in 2001. So massive benefit for the Chinese economy. So this has been remarkably positive for the Chinese. So trade has increased. These figures are just incredible. Between the United States and China, trade has increased more than 30 times, from less than $8 billion in 1986 to over $578 billion in 2016. So they easily surpassed Germany to become the largest exporter of goods. And there's this science park in China, for example, to tell you about what's happened with the economy. This one area holds over 20,000 companies that the government's been supporting to help develop products and get involved in the export economy. So we can see here that in terms of even though there's been this massive increase of money flowing into China, that their gross domestic product on a per capita basis, that means per individual, it's grown, but it's substantially lower than the United States. So they're not living. The point is that they're not living at the they don't have the living standards that we do in the U.S. Okay, so what would happen to China's political system? The hopes was that it would open up their economy and that they would move towards democracy. Yet what has happened has been the opposite, that greater economic growth led to greater political control. That means control over their own people. So they have tight control over businesses, and the internet use is highly regulated and limited, so they're using it, basically technology, to monitor their own people so they can identify dissidents. So they did not conform to the democracy or move towards democracy as the U.S. and the EU had hoped. The economic gains legitimized the Chinese Communist Party, that the Chinese government controls that extend to the internet, as I said, has been used for controlling their own people, and they have blocked political organizing by threatening and jailing people who post critical comments. So criticism is not accepted, and they're using the internet to identify, track, and detain dissidents. Great show that was on Frontline on PBS on April of 2020. So instead of conforming as other countries had hoped, China's using the WTO to its advantage. They've incurred significant amount of criticism for market distorting practices, and they've been accused of cheating in various ways, and they have the allegations against China has been manifested in many WTO disputes. And as you know, there's a whole dispute process through the WTO, and the U.S. has lodged 23 of the 43 cases against China. So 43 cases against China, about half came from the U.S. And sometimes there's been some other co-defendants. Okay, so the bulk of the allegations against China say that China's been promoting its exports while remaining largely closed to foreign goods. So that makes it much more difficult for countries and companies to do business in China. In other words, China is not importing as many goods as these countries expected, and that would be a violation of the WTO agreements. Some of the main things about the complaints, elements of the complaints, is that the U.S. has been saying that China's been subsidizing its manufacturing industry. Here's a quote: that China uses its basic tax laws and other tools to encourage exports and discriminate against imports of a variety of American manufactured goods. Very serious complaint. And in 2006, the European Union warned China about failing to open its economy to foreign imports, and they were threatening WTO disputes. So most of the cases fall into these three categories: providing illegal state subsidies because they want to be an exporting country. The second is discriminating against foreign goods and supplies because China wants to prioritize its own domestic manufacturing. The third is controlling supply chains, which we've discussed supply chains earlier. Why? Because China wants to or favors exporting finished products, not intermediate goods. So they want to control their entire supply chain. So at a fundamental level, the U.S., European Union, Japan want economic transitions with China because there's money to be made. China's rapidly enlarging, an opening market, but it's not a democracy, but it has engaged in capitalism. And the critics have voiced many concerns and have filed complaints with the WTO about their how China has ignored the rules of the WTO. But the other component here is that it is now China's integration into the WTO is increasingly connected the countries of the world. Okay, so where are the concerns then about human rights and the environment? There's no specific requirement of the WTO for human rights and or the environment. So there's your key problem right there. And why? Because it's not seen as being politically expedient. The higher goal of the WTO is access to markets, not human rights, not environmental improvement. So their stated beliefs has been that capitalism would eventually affect China and then influence people to demand rights and reduce poverty, and for them to engage in sustainable practices. It's said that the fruits of government ripen slowly, and perhaps they ripen extraordinarily slowly in Japan, in China. So do we just need patience to see if the benefits of trade will result in social change and sustainability? Maybe it'll take time, but then the other question is, do we have enough time, considering the gravity of some of these environmental issues, such as global climate change and social and political pressures, as we have more and more people who are demanding things like democracy, in particular in Hong Kong. So are human rights affected? Yeah, you bet. So in China, they've been, despite them being internationally visible, they continue to violate human rights. Tortures used, imprisonment of journalists, lack of progress in human rights, and no apparent movement towards democracy. Just a few photos of the people in poverty. And so the issues are about labor practices being unfair to workers, denial to workers' rights, labor repression, the penal system, that significant numbers of people being incarcerated. Could be that there's second highest, maybe U.S. is number one. There's debate on that, although the U.S. doesn't imprison people strictly for political reasons. And China executes more people than anyone in the world. So, and then there's the issues of Tibet, and then there are some other regions as well. So there are, there's significant issues. Also in China's workplace, they have more people employed than we have people in the United States. Nearly twice as many people working. And 10% of the population is below the poverty line, but as we said, it's over 400 million have been moved out of poverty. It's believed that they're using some slave labor for some of these jobs. That was about 1 million, and that some of the slave labor has caused the loss of jobs in the U.S., in particular in the United States textile and apparel market. Okay, so it's believed that there's something like 50,000 workers, mostly young women, that are getting paid nearly something like 25 cents an hour, and that there's a huge number of people that are dying in China because of industrial accidents, because of the lack of safety. In the United States, we have rules about protecting worker safety. These things don't exist in China. And other abuse in the workplaces, large number of hours to work, no overtime pay, people don't get leaves and vacation, a lot of discrimination against people, and there's no trade unions. Unions, as you may know, provide and argued for many rights for workers in the U.S., and you can be thankful that they have. I know I am. And then there's this concern over Hong Kong. Until 1997, Hong Kong was ruled by the British as a colony, but then returned to China under this one country, two systems rule, which we discussed at the beginning of this lecture. It has some autonomy, and it has more rights for its people. Well, there was a protest that began in June of 2019 against plans to allow the extradition of people to mainland China. So China was finding people that they believed to be dissidents that they wanted brought to China, from Hong Kong to China. And then the concern was that this would expose people in Hong Kong to unfair trials and violent treatment in China. And it would also give China greater influence over Hong Kong. It could be used to target activists and journalists. So it was clearly an attack on this one country, two systems, by having that China was trying to make them more communist, less capitalist, and less democratic. So the critics feared that this would undermine the judicial independence and endanger these dissidents. And hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, and then after weeks of protest, eventually the idea that came from China, they said that this would be suspended. So it was withdrawn, but the demonstrators don't really trust China, and they're demanding a full democracy. Here's some photos from the Hong Kong protests of 2019. Looks like more people attended that than Trump's inauguration, right? Okay, so China also has been noted for exploiting China, more so in this area of called Darfur. Over 200,000 people have been killed in this region, not directly by the Chinese, but the Chinese have been selling millions of dollars worth of arms, weapons, to the Sudanese government, which then uses to assault civilians in the area so they can control the area and then export oil, mostly oil, but there's also some minerals used for electronics to China. So China is the United Nations has taken some action to condemn the Sudan, but China keeps using its veto to delay any action from the United Nations. So Beijing's support, again, is largely the product of this dependent relationship they have, mostly about oil, because the Sudan provides about 6% of China's oil, and China ends up buying 60% of Sudan's oil. So Sudan relies on China significantly. Great story about this on CBS News and their 60 Minutes program. So some opinions from the global community on all this. I think these are important to bring out to you, that China is contributing to the degradation of the conditions for workers and the environment, resulting in a race to the bottom in wages and environmental quality. Another, the most extreme cases of misery and repression can be found in China, thanks to the fact that its enormous and desperate population of unemployed have no choice but to accept starvation wages and suffer abuse. And thirdly, another, thus the WTO and the process of globalization have tilted the economic playing field in favor of investors and against workers and the environment, resulting in a race to the bottom in wages and environmental quality. So, environmental issues. There are many within China, many of which are caused by this rapid economic growth, huge demands of resources for markets, industrialization, the rise of the middle class, more people buying automobiles, and buying automobiles meaning producing more air pollutants, and then there's lack of air pollution control standards on both vehicles and stationary air pollution sources like coal burning plants to produce electricity. And then another is that Chinese have dumped millions of tons of electronics waste, not just those that they import from other countries, but stuff that they generate themselves. And so that includes television sets, refrigerators, washing machines, computers, and millions and millions and millions of cell phones. And these electronic waste include very poisonous elements such as lead, mercury, cadmium, that are harmful to both humans and the environment. Another is acid rain, so that's acid deposition, which affects nearly 300 urban areas, about half of all cities. And the major source of that is burning coal for energy. Most of its large waterways are severely polluted, and more about air pollution here on this one, and the number of cars greatly increasing, producing more smog. So solutions to some of this, China has been engaging in some of those more recently, so this might be an indication that whereas their priority has been to use trade for economic development and production, their secondary priority may be coming into place where now they're starting to address environmental issues. And that could also be because there's been a significant amount of protests within China to reduce environmental problems because it's threatening their health. So they have been enforcing regulations governing the treatment of waste electronic equipment, and making producers more responsible for collecting and recycling and reusing product waste. Yet they still need about 10,000 wastewater treatment plants. We have these in the U.S. for all cities. It's required. China's still trying to get that in, and it's going to cost them a significant amount of money to do that. Very doable, as I see it. So the immediate reform of government branches would help increase the efficiency to monitor pollution and enforce standards. And so they have been working on some policies to reduce environmental problems. And here's a list of some of these laws and regulations that they have been recently developed. And globally, in terms of the environment, China has become the world's greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions due to the rapid industrial expansion. And so they're producing more greenhouse gases than the United States. Yet China is still recognized as being a developing nation. This doesn't seem to make much sense. And so the U.S. is actually, while the U.S. has not taken as much action as certainly what it needs, and not even recognized the reality of global climate change because of greenhouse gases. Perhaps they're playing a game where what they really want to do is put pressure on China to have China reduce this. So maybe we'll see something positive with this political battle between the two, but that's only going to happen if we have the political leaders to do so, which we currently don't have. If you've been following anything with Congress, you know what I'm talking about. So China's emissions have been growing, and China's air pollutants have surpassed the combined emissions of the UK, Canada, Germany, and Japan. So these are some of the largest economies of the world. So there's significant opportunities for improvement here. Yet on the other hand, China has invested more money in clean tech, in particular solar, than any other, and it's probably because they're trying to control the market, and so that they're trying to best Germany and the U.S., which are also been major manufacturers of solar technology. And China's also been engaged in producing wind turbines, more wind turbines than any other country. They also have these issues with water, not having enough, so they've built one of the largest dams in the world, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River. There's others. I won't get into a lot of depth there, but significant water distribution issues and water pollution problems. So projections for the future: China's economy will continue to grow. They're on track for continued rise as a global economic and trading power. Many believe that the Chinese economy will actually surpass, their GDP will surpass the United States in 2030, maybe 2040. That they will continue to face substantial changes or challenges in maintaining political stability in the face of rising transitory unemployment and a demand for human rights and reduced environmental pollution. Yet, despite all this, there's significant problems that are maintained. They've been manipulating their currency to make to alter monetary exchanges of value. In other words, that they can buy more export more. They've been known to export goods that are contaminated. The U.S. is spending billions to monitor and test products, yet still the U.S. only monitors about 1% of all imported foodstuffs. It's something to think about when you go shopping. Product quality problems. There's been many about lead in products, toxic pet food. Perhaps you heard of that recently. It was in the news. Drywall that has toxic components, toothpaste that has been toxic, milk products. Some of this, in one of the fields that I'm in, it's a big time is recycling, and one of the things that we've dealt with is that when there's been some product recalls and you have all this stuff that's got lead in it, then people are encouraged to discard it. So our question is, should it be discarded as a hazardous material, or can it just go into a landfill where it might then create another type of pollutant? So significant problems. There's been pirated intellectual property that's well known. Top firms are being spied on, and we have banks and financial institutions that are concerned about being monitored, and that there's believed. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And so some of this comes down to in terms of problems for doing business in China include these things like corruption, instability of their policies, inefficient bureaucracy. Now, the corruption part is very significant because, I've actually been told by some people who export recyclables about how they will provide significant amount of cash to pay off people in China to accept certain materials. Now, this is just anecdotal, but nonetheless, I understand this to be a problem, and it's because you have people that work in a communist system, and communist systems are susceptible to significant corruption. So here's this other list that all comes from the World Economic Forum. Okay, so many of this. There's so much information out there. I just want to point out to you that there are many sources you can go to if you wanted to do any additional research on this. So the issues in China point out this need to address how we use resources and pollutants. We know that resources will become pollutants, that people get radical when they're not being treated well, and the environment that they live in is disrupted, and that affects their health, and then people protest, and then that leads to violence. So then that brings up the question then about the WTO, and maybe what it needs to do is to establish and require some global standards about the treatment of workers, the exploitation of workers, about energy efficiency, to reduce pollution of greenhouse gases, to require the management of effluent, that means air pollution, water pollution, for companies to internalize their externalities. In other words, don't let companies create products and waste that then the public has to pay for, make the company, by putting design for the environment requirements on companies, that reduces the cost to taxpayers, ratepayers, and other countries where materials end up, and basically including some environmental standards and products such as recycled content, and as I said, improving health standards. So the WTO then could address these issues about how China exploits citizens and human rights and environmental handling by having these same rules applied to every other country that are members. And this is significant since about 97% of the countries of the world are members of the WTO. All right, so that's it. That's the end of this one, and I'll catch you on the next one.